The association of Black communities with well-done steaks has deep historical and cultural roots, shaped by systemic challenges and culinary ingenuity. During slavery, enslaved Africans were often given the toughest, least desirable cuts of meat. To make these cuts edible and safe, they developed slow cooking techniques that tenderized the meat while ensuring it was thoroughly cooked. This method not only addressed safety concerns, but also infused the meat with rich flavors, creating a tradition that became a hallmark of Black culinary practices. As time progressed, these cooking methods persisted through the Jim Crow era, when Black families often faced economic exploitation and limited access to fresh, high-quality meat. Butchers and grocers frequently sold nearly expired or substandard cuts to Black customers, forcing them to cook the meat thoroughly to avoid illness. This necessity reinforced the preference for well-done meat as a practical and safe choice. Culturally, well-done steak became more than just a cooking style. It symbolized resilience and adaptability in the face of systemic barriers. It reflected a legacy of making the most out of limited resources while preserving health and dignity. Today, while steak doneness preferences vary widely within the Black community, the historical preference for well-done meat remains a testament to the ingenuity and perseverance of past generations. The historical evolution of cooking meat and the concept of doneness is deeply tied to human survival, cultural shifts, and culinary advancements. Early humans began cooking food as far back as 780,000 years ago, with fire serving as a tool not just for warmth but for making food safer and easier to eat. This primal act of roasting over open flames laid the foundation for what would eventually become a sophisticated culinary art. By the time of the Renaissance, cooking had evolved significantly. In Europe, particularly in France and England, chefs began experimenting with flavors and textures, realizing that controlling cooking temperatures could enhance both. Although the specific term doneness doesn't have a pinpointed origin, variations of it existed as early as the 12th century. By the 17th century, cookbooks provided detailed instructions on preparing meat to different levels of doneness, introducing terms like rare, medium rare, and well done. This evolution reflects not just advancements in cooking methods, but also changes in societal values around food. What began as a necessity for survival transformed into an art form that celebrated flavor, texture, and personal preference. Today's debates over steak doneness are rooted in these centuries-old developments, showing how food continues to be a marker of culture and identity. The abundance of cattle in the Americas during the early days of settlement made steak a practical food source for pioneers and settlers. Cattle, introduced by Spanish explorers, thrived in the New World, grazing on the vast grasslands that stretched across the continent. This created an ample supply of beef, making it a staple protein for those living in the frontier. Cooking methods during this time were simple and functional. Settlers often prepared their meat over open flames or rudimentary grills, focusing primarily on making it edible and safe. The concept of steak doneness, as we know it today, had not yet been formalized. Meat was typically cooked thoroughly to reduce health risks, a necessity in a time when food safety practices were minimal. As America entered the 19th century, the Industrial Revolution brought significant advancements in food production and preparation. Factories and new technologies revolutionized how food was processed and distributed, making steak more accessible to urban populations. This period also marked the rise of restaurants and fine dining establishments where chefs began experimenting with cooking techniques that highlighted flavors and textures, paving the way for modern preferences in steak doneness. Advancements in cooking appliances and temperature control revolutionized how meat was prepared, allowing for greater precision and consistency. This innovation paved the way for the rise of steakhouses in urban hubs like Chicago and New York, catering to a growing middle to upper class eager for a refined dining experience. It was during this era that the concept of steak doneness, ranging from rare to medium, began to take shape, influencing both culinary trends and customer preferences. The post-World War II period marked another turning point in the history of steak doneness in America. Urbanization, paired with the booming popularity of backyard barbecues, turned grilling into a beloved social activity. Americans started experimenting with different levels of doneness, leading to distinct regional preferences. For example, the Midwest became known for favoring medium to medium well steaks, while coastal regions leaned toward rarer preparations. Despite these shifts, well-done steaks remained a staple in many households, reflecting a blend of tradition and individual taste. This enduring preference highlights the diversity of steak culture across the nation. The association of Black Americans with well-done steaks is deeply rooted in history, shaped by the harsh realities of slavery and systemic inequities. During slavery, enslaved Africans were often given discarded tough cuts of meat that were considered undesirable. Faced with these challenges, they turned to slow cooking methods like braising and barbecuing, transforming these scraps into tender, flavorful dishes infused with spices and herbs, a practice inspired by their African culinary traditions. These cooking techniques served both practical and safety purposes. Thoroughly cooking meat reduced the risk of foodborne illnesses, which was critical in a time when medical care was scarce. This tradition continued through the Jim Crow era, when economic exploitation limited access to high-quality meat, reinforcing the preference for well-cooked food as a necessity rather than a choice. Even after emancipation, these practices evolved into cultural staples. The Great Migration brought African Americans from the rural South to urban centers, where they gained access to better cuts of meat, but still honored their culinary roots. Well-done meat remained a symbol of safety, resilience, and resourcefulness within Black communities. Today, while steak preferences vary widely, the tradition of well-cooked meat reflects a history of adaptation and survival that continues to influence Black culinary practices. Adapted through the harsh realities of enslavement, enslaved Africans brought their rich culinary traditions to the Americas and infused them with Southern cuisine. Faced with scraps and tough cuts of meat often deemed inedible, they turned to slow cooking methods like barbecuing and braising. These techniques transformed necessity into culinary innovation, rendering even the toughest meats tender and delicious. Over time, this tradition of well-cooked meats became a hallmark of Black kitchens. It was born out of both necessity and cultural adaptation. Cooking meat thoroughly ensured it was safe to eat, especially in an era when foodborne illnesses were rampant and medical care was scarce. Thoroughly cooked meat, especially pork and poultry, was not just a preference, but a survival strategy. This approach to cooking reflects resilience and creativity, turning limited resources into flavorful meals that are now celebrated as staples of Southern cuisine. From smoky barbecues to slow-braised dishes, these practices are a testament to the ingenuity of enslaved Africans, whose influence continues to shape American culinary traditions today. The Great Migration, which saw millions of African Americans move from the rural South to urban centers in the North and West, marked a transformative period in Black culinary history. This mass movement brought Southern food traditions like barbecue, fried chicken, and slow-cooked greens to new regions, fostering cultural exchange and adaptation. Access to better cuts of meat and a wider variety of ingredients allowed for experimentation with cooking methods and levels of doneness, blending old traditions with new opportunities. These innovations honored their Southern roots while creating fresh culinary expressions in bustling cities like Chicago, Detroit, and Los Angeles. However, the Jim Crow era's systemic inequities deeply impacted African Americans' access to food. Economic exploitation meant that black families often faced discriminatory pricing and limited availability of quality ingredients. Even something as simple as purchasing food was shaped by racial barriers. This harsh reality reinforced the tradition of cooking meat thoroughly, ensuring safety in a time when foodborne illnesses were common and medical care was scarce. Despite these challenges, African Americans preserved their culinary heritage while adapting to new environments. The resilience displayed during this time not only shaped the evolution of black cuisine, but also left an enduring legacy on American food culture. The systemic exploitation of black communities during the Jim Crow era extended even to the basic act of purchasing food. Imagine walking into a grocery store where shelves were nearly empty, produce was bruised, and meat was past its expiration date. For many black families, this was their daily reality. Butchers, fully aware of the limited options available to black shoppers, often sold nearly expired meat without hesitation. To ensure safety, black families had no choice but to cook the meat thoroughly, a practice born out of necessity rather than preference. This wasn't just poor business practice, it was a deliberate part of the systemic barriers designed to demean and exploit black communities. Grocery stores and butchers were just one cog in the larger machine of Jim Crow oppression. Segregation and economic exploitation left black families with limited access to mainstream markets or high-quality goods. As a result, they often relied on local businesses within their own communities. Unfortunately, these small black-owned businesses faced their own struggles. Operating within a system intent on keeping black people economically disadvantaged, these businesses often lacked the resources to provide high-quality goods. This created a cycle of hardship, limited access to quality food, reinforced by systemic inequities that kept black communities from thriving. Despite these challenges, black families showed resilience by adapting and creating culinary traditions that remain significant today. The systemic exploitation of black communities during the Jim Crow era extended beyond public accommodations and into the food supply chain, where discriminatory practices were deeply entrenched. While direct documentation of butchers specifically selling expired or low-quality meat to black customers is sparse, the collective memory of African Americans, passed down through generations, paints a compelling picture of these injustices. Tales of butchers knowingly offloading nearly expired products to black families align with the broader patterns of economic exploitation and racial discrimination that defined the era. This practice was not merely a reflection of poor business ethics, but a deliberate reinforcement of systemic inequities. Black communities often had limited access to mainstream markets due to segregation and redlining, forcing them to rely on local businesses that were themselves trapped in cycles of economic disadvantage. These small businesses struggled to provide high-quality goods, further perpetuating the exploitation of black customers. By the mid-20th century, however, a wave of change swept through America with the civil rights movement. This movement not only fought for justice and equality, but also ignited a renewed sense of pride and empowerment within the African American community. This cultural shift extended into the kitchen, where African American chefs and cooks began reclaiming their culinary heritage and gaining long overdue recognition for their contributions to American cuisine. Their culinary skills highlighted a rich and diverse food heritage that had often been ignored. Among these traditions, one stood out prominently, a preference for well-done steaks. Today, across America, the way people choose to cook a steak represents more than just individual tastes. As we mentioned earlier, steak preferences are deeply tied to traditions and family histories. Many people enjoy their steaks well done as a choice rooted in generational cooking practices, often linked to safety concerns and methods passed down through families. Across the broader landscape of American steak preferences, we see that different levels of doneness tell unique stories. Statistics reveal that medium rare is the most popular doneness, with about 38% of steak lovers worldwide favoring this level, while 32% of Americans prefer their steak cooked medium. Other preferences, like rare and medium well, each account for around 12%, and well-done steaks are chosen about 6% of the time. However, within the African American community, a distinct pattern emerges. Medium well steaks are preferred by 37%, reflecting a trend that differs from the national average. Close behind are medium and well-done steaks, with 28% and 25% of African Americans favoring these levels, respectively. This shows that African Americans still hold a strong preference for well-done steaks. Before we wrap up, we'll leave you with one final thought. Renowned food writer and historian Jessica B. Harris beautifully summarized the connection between African Americans and their steak preferences. The African American table is one that is rooted in the legacy of survival, adaptation, and ultimately, resilience. Thank you.